I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode. This week's guest is Fergus Garrett, head gardener at Great Dixter, an historic house and garden in East Sussex. I'm extremely grateful that Fergus agreed to come on the podcast, and I'm delighted that we all have the opportunity to share in his enthusiasm for Great Dixter and for everything that makes it the truly special place it is. Over the past 4 or so years, experts from many fields have come together to record the biodiversity of the site, and the results have been fascinating. I began by asking Fergus what had prompted him to commission a biodiversity audit.
Well, it's a strange thing, really. For years we knew that we were rich in wildlife at Dixter because we always used to celebrate seeing those glorious great crested newts and then see the odd woodpecker here and there and so on. And I used to always come home because Amanda, my wife, an ecologist really, and I used to say to her, I've seen such and such and I've seen such and such, and she always used to say, that's all very well, darling, but you should really look at the whole picture. Dixter's a special place, and I bet you have got really good wildlife there, but you want to look at the whole thing so that you get a good baseline study. And not being in her world, I sort of took a degree of notice of this, but really ignored it, to be honest, and so didn't really do anything about it. And then just in dribs and drabs, we started doing, the bee people came to look at bumblebees. We had moth surveys done by a wonderful man called Tony Harmon. And then you'd see the results were quite impressive. But then Amanda would again say to me, you're only sort of celebrating one thing here and there. You should really do the whole lot, get baseline studies for Dixter, because that'll give you the complete picture of what's there, how you can move forward, and also you ought to tie it in with the local records as well, so that it's part of that sort of wider system where people mapping out wildlife. And so, when I actually sat down and sort of talked it through with her, everything made sense, and that's why we wanted to do this sort of complete survey, and we had to think hard about how we were going to do it. But we got to a stage at Dixter where it was important to look after the place when Christo was there, and also to look after Christo, and then he passed away, and then we had to save the place, because he only owned 40% of it, so we had to buy the other 60% with the charitable trust, and then find our footing to make sure that we were heading in the right direction and that we weren't going to either be over-commercialised or abuse the place in any way, and we put all our energies into the sort of the welfare of the place, but also the welfare of the people in it, and also then into education and so on. And we started to make sure that we were sort of completing that sort of way forward until I thought, well, actually, what's the next thing after this? Well, the next thing after that was to make sure that we looked after not just the garden but the wider estate. So I didn't think about the garden as for biodiversity. I was thinking about the woodlands and the pasture land and the meadows and so on. And so I wanted to do something so that years after either me or this current lot of trustees, that we had enough information to actually guide the people who are going to take over from us. And there's so much information about the garden and the sense of place about the garden and the buildings, but there wasn't much about those sort of glorious bits of ancient woodland and things like that we had there. So I thought this, getting a survey like this would help in that respect, that it would sort of protect the estate in years to come, so that people didn't mess around with it too much.
So when did you start doing the audit?
So we started, the study started about 4 years ago, I suppose. This way of starting about 4 years ago, but we couldn't really do the whole lot until we got some funding behind it, and that's why the Heritage Lottery Fund was so brilliant. And as well as that, the Hartnetts and the Richardsons, who are sort of friends of Dixter, that all wanted to support this as well. So we bunged all that in together so that we could get a really comprehensive study done, not just picking out butterflies and not just picking out moths and bees, and the fancy things, but looking at everything from lichen to mosses, and also looking at the archaeology of the land, because, the historic land use of it does affect what's there. The management of the land affects what's got the resulting biodiversity. So we wanted to get a whole picture of it. And so initially we were thinking about doing the woodlands and the pasture land, but we thought we'd just, because it's all one estate, just look at the whole bit, everything in together. And so, excited about this, I first of all approached a few groups and asked them if they would come just to see, just to sort of test the water a bit. And it's surprising that a few of them didn't want to come into a garden because they felt that the results in a garden would be, wouldn't be very exciting. And in fact, one of them said, well, actually, we've done enough gardens and we find on the whole that they're sterile. So we're not so much interested in gardens. And I thought, well, actually, they don't realise how rich Dixter is. And so I actually I tricked them by saying, well, and this was the British Arachnological Society, who are a wonderful group actually, and we're all members of them at Dixter. I was starting to make more and more students the members, and Dixter's a member of it as well. So it's a sort of organisation that looks like spiders in the United Kingdom. And so I said to them, why don't you have your annual general meeting here? You can use the building, and we'll give you drink and food. And so you can just have the whole place to yourself. And so they came, and at lunchtime they went out to look at a compost heap and found a really lovely range of spiders there. And they found an interesting jumping spider on a fence outside the horse pond. And they found another spider that I think hadn't been spotted since 1903. And so from there, because they found so many species, they suddenly became interested and said, well, do you mind if we come back and survey again? And so invited their friends to come. And so from there it just sort of ballooned out, and suddenly there was a great deal of interest. But again, we need to contain it and do it all together so that this report came out of it, so that we went forward in the right way. And I suppose what I mean by went forward in the right way is that we got all the information into one point, and got somebody to look at all the information and come up with a management plan for the whole estate and the garden, so that in terms of biodiversity, we do the right things for it. And now the right things for it may be targeting certain species that are relatively rare in the area, whether that be the longhorn bee or something else, or whether we try and manage the place in such a way that we increase the biodiversity, you see, or do both of those things. So it just meant that we had the information so that we could plan for the future in the right way and do the right thing for the estate.
So were they surprised, apart from the people who came to look at the spiders, were most people who came to survey the site surprised actually by the biodiversity there?
Yes, they were really surprised. I mean, it's not surprising because the estate has been managed in a similar way for all those years. So you've got those glorious ancient woodlands and so on, and the long grass beyond it, and also, those fantastic rich meadows that are in Dixter, the garden itself. But I think what they were really surprised by was that here we are as a intensive, highly ornamental garden that doesn't garden for biodiversity. We garden for flowers. We flower because we were open from April to October. We have this long season of display. Some of it is dug up and replanted again. Some of it is multi-layered. Some of it is shrubs and trees and so on. And so I think the people were really surprised how rich the garden itself was. In fact, I think somebody produced a heat map of the biodiversity. Now, that could be dismissed as nonsense because it depends where you set your traps and so on. And one area feeds into another. It all works as one unit. But that heat map showed that the garden was extraordinarily rich. And that's not, when you analyse that, it's not surprising because of the long season of flowers that we've got, but also the wide range of habitats that we've got there as well, from porous walls to porous buildings to water to mud to long grass, short grass, to shrubberies, to leaf litter, etc., etc., etc. Even bare ground, which is important. So it just all adds up to a sort of a wonderful habitat, and but I find it fascinating to look at the place through the eyes of an entomologist or a bryologist or one of those sort of specialists, because first of all I realised, even though I've been gardening for years and have sort of got a certain skill level, I realised how little I knew about the things that shared the garden with us, and also how little I knew about the habitats that were necessary to support these things. So you want to create a wildlife garden, so you put a meadow in and think that's it, or you plant a few pollinators, but it's not just about giving things a food source, it's about giving things a place to live as well. And so, and I never, ever, ever, ever thought about the importance of short grass or bare ground next to long grass or those sort of things that actually adds up to something extraordinary. So I found that fascinating.
And how did the ornamental areas compare to the wilder areas? Did they look at that?
They did, but they didn't actually. They went away from. They sort of pulled us away from thinking that one area was richer than the other, because they wanted to look at it as a whole. So, and because even though you may only have a few species, say on a north-facing slope, those few species may contain the queen bees in the north-facing slope. So if you didn't have that area, then it wouldn't support all the sort of community beyond that. So they said that one area feeds into another. So they looked as, but importantly, they said that the gardening model that we have there is amazing. Important things like we don't spray. We stopped spraying when Christo died. And so we've sprayed less and less. We haven't lifted up a can of sort of spray for about 15 years there now. So that's amazing. So these guys who were slightly sort of nervous about coming into a garden now call us a garden nature reserve, which is interesting. And they're saying that the fact that we've got so much variety there, that's an important thing. Because even those areas that we dig and disturb on a regular basis, they're an important part of this whole thing. And I remember actually thinking back, the influence of Amanda on all of this, and because I remember asking her about creating a green roof at Dixter years and years ago. And she said, well, I think what would be really interesting is not to put another green roof or a green space in, but actually create a roof and just leave it as sandy soil and see what comes in, because that's an area that you haven't got much of. And I thought, well, that's crazy, putting sandy, just leaving it bare like that. What good is that going to be for all the wildlife that wants the greenery and the food plants and whatever? And she was absolutely right, you see. So and I think we're really creative people, and we can be creative in the garden, and we think sort of laterally, but in order to do that, we need the knowledge, you see. And that's why working with these specialists was just so fascinating, because they gave us that every little bit of knowledge they gave us about habitats or insects, we could actually, with the freedom of a garden, rather than being in a treble SI where you're restricted or something like that, the freedom of a garden, we could actually play around with habitats and make things happen for them without compromising the aesthetics of that garden, you know. And for them, it was a real eye-opener, because here we are as an ornamental intensive garden, and we're as rich as any nature reserve that's around us, you know. And so, and then when you think about that, and when you think about the Dixter model, and you look at, you know, what have you got? You've got buildings that can accept bees and insects and so on, etc. You've got roof spaces that can have, be habitats for things. You've got timber that can be habitats. You've got water. You've got holes in walls. You've got vegetation. You've got bare ground where bees can nest in and other things can nest in. You've got a long season of pollen and nectar for things to feed off, etc. So you've got this mosaic of habitats. Well, that whole thing can be mimicked in a town or a city or a village, long grass, short grass, areas that are cut more often, people's gardens to give the food, etc., etc., etc. So if we sort of take something like Dixter and say, well, we're X, Y, Z happens there. Well, you can make a town have X, Y, Z happen there. So it's, so the wildlife doesn't need to exist in all these sort of areas outside of towns and cities and villages. It can actually flow through an area like that. But in order to make that happen, you need again knowledge. You need to sort of get into bed with entomologists and ecologists and those sort of people, and so politicians and town and city planners, architects, local volunteer groups, anybody, gardeners, landscape contractors, landscape architects, garden designers. If there was sort of a degree of cohesive thinking and towards the planning of new spaces or open spaces or tackling the city, then surely something interesting could happen there. I mean, it's all within our reach. All we've got to do is work together on all of this. And so I think that's the really exciting thing that's come out of this. Because if Dixter can be a haven for wildlife, an ornamental garden that grows dahlias and begonias and all that sort of stuff, then everybody's back garden can be a haven for wildlife, as long as we know what we're aiming for. And so it was again interesting. I asked one of the ecologists, so should we have a list of do's and don'ts? And he said, well, actually, maybe a few don'ts, maybe a few do's, but actually if you're too prescriptive, you don't get the diversity. Whereas if you just say, A, don't spray, and B, do this, and then leave people to do the rest, you get something that's quite energetic and quite interesting that comes out of that. And so I think this sort of thing can happen. Well, it has to happen, really. It has to happen. And especially so, they're looking at the land, not the Dixter land, but the other land surrounding a place like Dixter, and saying that the countryside is quite sterile. It's all sort of been, there's living daylights have been sprayed out of it or cultivated or whatever and so on. And so that this sort of, this element of sort of rewilding certain parts comes into it, but actually gardens around the countryside or in can make up for the loss within the countryside. And Sarah, it was, I was trying to get them to explain why is a garden rich, and this one guy said to me, well, if you look at what's been lost in the British countryside, quite a lot of woodland edge has been lost. So, you have wood and then you have grassland, and there's no that in-between ecotone, and that's the bit that's disappeared. And those ecotones, those in-between areas, are actually, they've got the potential of being extraordinarily rich. And so, what is a garden? Well, it's a woodland edge, isn't it? It's because it's got trees, shrubs, herbaceous plants, the whole lot in it. And to that, you add the fact that it's got a diversity of flowers. They don't have to be native. It's got a diversity of flowers and a diversity of habitats. Then it's the perfect storm, isn't it? Then it can add up to something quite significant, really. So I think this is only the start. The more people get hold of this, something quite exciting could happen. But it has to happen in a sort of semi-cohesive way for it to all to add up and knit up and work together.
And how could gardeners and garden designers, landscape architects, those kind of people, how could they reach out to people like entomologists and work with them? Can you see that happening easily? Do you think there's the will to interact?
Well, it's interesting because I think just gardeners. I mean, gardeners have thought about wildlife gardens as being a potential mess, and entomologists and ecologists have thought of gardens as being sterile, alien landscapes. Okay, so those sort of barriers have got to be broken down first of all. But I think, of course, it can happen. It can happen. It can happen through large organisations like the National Trust and the RHS and those sort of things. It can happen through botanic gardens. It can happen through private gardens like Dixter. It can happen through the Historic Houses Association. It can happen through all those bodies. But as well as that, it can happen when a village, say, wants to do something for biodiversity. Now, when they want to do something for biodiversity, they immediately think, well, we're going to let a woodland, a roadside verge grow. But it's not just about that roadside verge, is it? It's about the whole village and what happens. So they can actually commission a quick audit on the whole village. And that audit would take in what the records show for the locality. They'd look at the habitats of the village. They look at long grass, short grass, meadow areas, etc., all of that. They look at potential sort of water habitats and building habitats, all of that, and then come up with X, Y, and Z to say, this is what you need more of, or this is what you've got plenty of, but you've only got it on one side of the village. You need to take it through the other side of the village because then it can join up with the meadow that you've got at the far end of the village that then continues. So that's a nice... So you need that specialist, that person, to have that overview and join it together. Yeah, not to the extent to say you've got to grow this flower, this flower, this flower in your garden. But just that sort of general overview to say the gardens are one thing, try and cut down on spraying, you haven't got enough scrub running through the village, so allow certain areas to be scrub, and they don't need to be prominent areas, they can be areas that are hidden away, but they'll form just to link all that stuff together. And I think, so of course it becomes impractical if one gardener with a small back garden employs an entomologist or ecologist to come and do an audit on that garden. That's fine, great on that, but actually it needs to work on, everything needs to add up, so it doesn't just want to be one garden, it wants to be 20 gardens. Better still, it wants to be the whole village, taking in everything. So, for instance, there are local villages to us that are looking at, their conservation bodies are looking at exactly this happening in a cohesive way. And so in the same way, then if there's any building that's going to be made in that village, then they can put pressure on the builders that are doing the new builds to do the necessary in order for them to get the planning permission and so on. And so I think things will start changing as long as people start thinking this way.
What struck me when I came to the talk that you gave the other day was how unique Dixter is, and it is the perfect storm because you've got the meadows and the woodland and the buildings and everything around the infrastructure in the garden, and it is all relatively unspoilt. And I thought then it struck me actually how rare a site it is, and how if we're not careful to protect those sites going forward, we could lose an awful lot of clues to where we should be going in the future. How many sites are there, do you think, like Dixter? Is it particularly rare? And in your opinion, is it very important that we do protect it in its state at the moment so that we can kind of study it?
I think that we're very fortunate in this country that there are many sites like Dixter. But it doesn't really need to be a protected site, you see. I mean, Dixter's got extraordinary orchids in those meadows and so on, but it doesn't take long for you to create an orchid meadow anyway. We've done it at Dixter. We've gone into pasture land that had the weeds sprayed from it and off it, and then within 7 years we've created an orchid-rich meadow in there. So that can happen. Now, as well as that, Sarah, what's happened is that the orchid-rich meadow on one side, and then there's a green field on the other side. The green field hasn't got orchids in it. We allow the grass to grow. The grass flowers. It's got a few sort of hogweed and cow parsley and bramble patches around it, a few bits of nettle here and there. And it's the plant fair field where we have our plant fair. It gets trampled 4 times a year. Well, actually, I think when they did the survey of insects there, that site had 3 times as many insects as the orchid-rich field in it, because the habitats were different. So you don't really need, that jewel box of flowers to create a habitat for something. So I think it's really important to have, those hot spots and those havens like Dixter to protect them, but actually you can build something out of wasteland or no man's land or neglected land. They too will have important life in them and have got the ability to support a greater life. And I think so. Every little space matters in a way, not just those hot spots. As a gardener, understanding the life in the garden like Dixter has made sort of every moment in a place like that a richer experience as a result of just knowing more about the insects and life that's there. And I remember the BBC film crew coming to photograph or film Dixter for Gardener's World, and they the cameraman focused on some solitary bee making a hole in the turf, and he waited and waited and waited and waited, and I think he said something like, "Oh, my wife was responsible for the David Attenborough film, and where the killer whale comes up on the beach and grabs the seal, and she got a BAFTA for it or something like that." And he said. I don't think I'll get a BAFTA for this, but it was equally as exciting, and that was just that one little bee going into the hole and coming back out. So there's just extraordinary, exciting life around us. We just got to sort of open our eyes to it, really. And I think in the way that we choose what we eat, how we travel. How we go about our daily lives, how we look after our spaces, whether they're our own spaces or the wildish land around us, that we've got to start thinking about all of this stuff really seriously now before it's too late.
So I'll just say a heartfelt thank you to Fergus for taking part in the interview. Wherever you are in the world, if you can, put Great Dixter on your bucket list and see the magic for yourself. Thanks for listening, and I will catch you all next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps, and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.